Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all. Thanks for being here, and we will call our meeting to order this morning, 8:02, July 30th, 2024, a virtual meeting of the Milton School Committee. The first thing to do is approve our agenda. Does anybody know of any changes to the agenda? Don't have many things on here, so okay. So we can just go ahead and keep moving. Hi, Amanda. Dr. Burrows is in a previously scheduled meeting that conflicts with this one, but we're happy to be joined by our great leadership team here. Thanks everybody for coming. So first on our agenda will be citizen speak. Just a reminder, this is an opportunity for us to hear from residents who may share their thoughts with us for up to 3 minutes at a time. I will keep the time here. Oh, I already see we have a couple hands raised. Let me get my timer thing set up. Okay. So
Mr.
Dr.
Johanning, he was the first to raise his hand.
Yes, okay, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Johanning, can you hear us? You can just go ahead and unmute in order to allow us to hear you.
My name is Phil Johanning. I live at 23 Parkwood Drive in Milton. The only thing I wanted to remind you about was the select board meeting the other night. I'm not sure how many of you might have seen it, but Mr. Wells, the chair, had promised to schedule a vote. And once he heard the amount of money that this project was expected to require, he decided not to hold the vote. And I think my interpretation of how he felt was that he was stunned by the amount. I think that if you want to resolve the school crowding issue that you say exists, I think one of the things you have to do is really look at scaling back the project. I think that a school can be built probably with the same number of classrooms, but not at 173 million. I think you're going to have trouble with voters in Milton. I know you'll have trouble with me. I do not support a $173 million debt exclusion override, and I don't support a $5 million operational override. I think it's more than most residents can bear. So I urge you to reconsider the number. I urge you to take a careful look at this project. If you want to succeed in Milton, I think the number has to be something else. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Johanning, for joining us to share your thoughts. Okay. Mr. Zulus is our next speaker. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Good morning, Mike Zulus, 69 Fairbanks Road. The communications network that connects our town departments, the schools, and our public safety agencies is a legacy Comcast fiber network that is more than 20 years old, does not allow for redundancy, and does not support the town's needs. The contract by which Comcast services that network has either expired or is expiring. For nearly 6 years, the town's Municipal Broadband Committee has worked with town staff, elected officials, and consultants to fix this problem. The fix is the construction of a new town-owned fiber optic network, which is known as an institutional network or an INET. The Municipal Broadband Committee achieved the goal of funding the INET project without the use of residential taxpayer money by cobbling together funds from Comcast, from an appropriation from the state legislature, and from ARPA. With the design of the new INET network having been completed this spring, the plan was to sign a contract for construction of the network this summer, to begin construction by September at the latest, and to complete the network by December 31st. That plan was thwarted last Tuesday night. Without any notice to the community, which has supported this project repeatedly over the last several years, the school department requested, the town administrator recommended, and the select board voted to defund the final stage of the INET project by removing the ARPA funds that had been appropriated for it more than 2.5 years ago, and using those funds instead to help close the sudden $2 million FY24 school department budget deficit. My understanding from Dr. Pavlicek is that the school department was unaware that the funds were being taken from the INET project, which would effectively kill it. While it may not have been your intention to kill the INET project, somebody put the gun in your hands. Please don't do it. Unless you immediately rescind the school department's request to use these funds, the INET project will be dead. Now, I know it's not on your agenda, but the school committee took no action on this in the first place. So you are well within your authority to express your individual opinions to the superintendent so he can reverse this action. Absent immediate action to rescind this request, the new INET project will not be completed this fall. There are other sources of funding to solve the school department's budget deficit, and I encourage you to pursue those. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zulus. So is anybody else here to participate in Citizen Speak? If so, can you raise your hand at this time, please? Okay. Glenn, there's nobody else raising their hands, right?
There are no other hands raised.
Okay. So we'll carry on, and as we all know, we don't respond directly to sentiments expressed during Citizen Speak. It's obviously likely that the questions raised by our first speaker will come up in the course of our agenda item discussion this morning. As for what Mr. Zulus shared, as he actually suggested, if any of you have questions or thoughts about this topic, I think it would be appropriate for you to follow up with Dr. Burrows. And, you know, we'll move forward from there. The key reminder for us is that the school department has followed the recommendation of the town administrator in this matter. So with that, we will move to Selena, who represent the school committee on the school building committee, so that you can both provide us with updates where we're at on this topic of the school building project. Thanks.
Great. I'll jump in, and Selena, I'm sure we'll correct all my errors, as she typically helps me do. So I sent y'all on Tuesday a copy of the cost estimate along with the feasibility report. The feasibility report was finalized, or I got the final copy of it sometime on Sunday. We talked about it essentially last week, the week before, as a committee, gone through some edits with it, sent that over to the cost estimator, Peter Bradley at PMC Estimating, who is a consultant for AeroStreet, and then he provided that. Again, it might have been Monday. The first time I saw was Tuesday, and then I sent that over to y'all. That obviously was a part of the conversation at the select board meeting when we were presenting on Tuesday. We honestly weren't 100% sure we were going to have a cost estimate at the time of the select board meeting, and the school building committee had not had any conversation about the amount because we didn't have a meeting before the select board meeting. School building committee met last night, and that was the first time we kind of talked about the amount and about the process. And I just want to share, if I can, a couple slides that Sean O'Rourke put together for the school building committee. Can y'all see this? I think this is just helpful as it lays out kind of what our path is. As y'all know, we've been, as a school building committee, working with urgency on this matter to try and get this in front of the town as soon as possible in order to control costs, because the sooner we build it, the less escalation there is, and also to quickly address the space need, which we all know is very important. So here's kind of where we are at generally in like the timeline for this ballot question, which is the next step of the project, right? The next step is figuring out how we can ask the town for funding for the project. And so the first step is the construction cost estimate, right, which we received on last Monday or Tuesday. Next, we'll need a 2/3 vote of the select board in order to put the ballot question language, in order to put the language on a fall ballot. So the select board has to approve it, then has to be certified by the town clerk, and that is sent to the state to essentially notify the state that Milton is looking to do a debt exclusion override above and beyond the 2.5 levy limit. So that's this step 3. So those are the things that currently we are working on that would need to happen. Once we get that done, then there's still a lot of other steps that obviously need to happen before the vote takes place in terms of discussions with the warrant committee, trying to get final approval of the project, support of the project from the warrant committee and select board, and obviously communication with the town. So there's still, again, the putting it on the ballot is not the final step. It's kind of one of the key pieces. And so again, this is where we are right now with step 2, trying to work with select board to see if they will put it on the ballot for folks to vote on. I also just want to share like what the language is on the ballot that we need to finalize by essentially the deadline for the select board to vote on that would be their meeting next Tuesday, because we need to submit it to the state by August 7th. And that is some state law that requires that sets that deadline for when we can set the ballot initiative. So if anything happens after August 7th, there's no chance of having this vote in November. The ballot question itself actually does not include an amount, which might be interesting for you to know. Certainly was interesting for me to know. So all this is the entire language that will be on the ballot. And this is true for any operational overrides. I'm sorry, any debt exclusion overrides. This is just yes or no, shall Milton be allowed to exempt from the provisions of Proposition 2.5? So that's important to note, is that I know the number is a big piece, and there still needs to be a lot of work to work on that number, refine our programming, see what we can do to pull down that number if possible. But that number does not need to be finalized as of next Tuesday. And in fact, the designers, the architects have the opportunity to kind of continue to work on this project and refine some things over time. So after we get it on the ballot, then again, it's kind of working to fully refine that number with to put that in the warrant article. So before the town votes on it, we would have the town meeting vote, and the town meeting is actually where the number is set. So this is what like the warrant article might look like at town meeting. I don't know if y'all can see that well. Essentially, this is where we put in the numbers. So town meeting would vote first, and town meeting would set the number. They would, we'd need 2/3 vote in town meeting to approve this with a number, and then that would tell the town, hey, this is the number, and then they would vote on that in November. The timeline there again would be like that there's a town meeting at some point in maybe late October, middle October, and then the obviously townwide election in November. So, and as I said, this kind of area between putting the language on the ballot And the warrant committee's final recommendation, similar to our budget process every year, is that's where we adjust things, right? That's what we call value management, where we can cut programming, find things maybe we forgot. Again, hopefully it's mostly just cutting, or at minimum maintaining. But that's kind of what would happen in this area. Again, similar to what we do with our budget, where we come forward and say like, hey, here's our budget. And then we work with the town to kind of whittle down the budget and get to an agreed upon number that the warrant committee would vote on. And again, after the warrant committee's recommendation, the town meeting would vote 2/3 to approve it, and then all townwide residents would vote. So I just wanted to share about that process and make that clear as to kind of where we are in terms of, again, we are sitting right here at step 2, and we got all these other things that would need to occur before we get to a November vote. Why don't I take a second and just pause, see if there are any questions y'all have about this timeline. And then we can jump into the project itself if you have questions about the feasibility report and cost estimate.
Yes, Anna, go ahead.
So Mark, you mentioned there's no dollar amount on the actual ballot question. How are we planning to get out to the community that this is what they would be voting on beforehand? Are we going to be contacting, let's say, if it's a presidential election, are we going to contact every single voter who's voted in the last several presidential elections and send a letter to each house? And how are we going to communicate this? Because this is tough, right? Like, yeah, it's a simple yes or no, but then it's also binding because, you know, if it passes, your property taxes increase. So how are we going to make sure that everybody knows prior to that they know what they're voting on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I will say again, I've never been through one of these, and this ballot language is like the ballot language for any operational, debt exclusion override. So on a new firehouse, this would be the case, or a new police department, whatever it is, new town hall. This apparently is just what the language is. So yeah, I think the process for engagement kind of all needs to fall in here. Into this value management, right? We need to reach out to folks and convince folks that, hey, this is something that is worth investing your money in as a town. We need to be clear about the programming, right? We need to gather support. Otherwise, it's going to fail, and it's going to be kind of a waste of time. So I think we have a lot of smart people in Milton who aren't just going to kind of write a blank check. So I think we need to get to a place, you know, pretty early as to, you know, how we are trying to value engineer this, what a pretty close amount is, and then have lots of community engagement sessions. I think typically within this type of override or an operational override, even there are outside folks outside of maybe our committee who might individually as voters within Milton support it and run their own campaign. I don't think we have a budget as a school committee to send out mailers ourselves. That's something I honestly don't know, and maybe Glenn or Glenn would know, but maybe Lizzie does.
But I think it's important to note that these are going to be two parallel processes that are happening at the same time, right? One of them is to get to the ballot question, but at the same time, the school building committee I know is committed to making sure that there are public meetings that happen to make sure that folks understand the project cost, the full project cost, right? Not just the construction, but the full project cost, and socializing that with folks so that when they get to the ballot, they have all the information they need to be able to make stand what's being asked of them.
When I was going to try to speak to Mark's question but would you probably might have a better answer for that.
Yeah, once it goes on the ballot, campaign finance laws come into effect. And so there's going to have to be a political action committee that actually runs the campaign to encourage a vote yes, or a campaign to encourage a vote no. But it's going to have to be done through a political action committee. The school committee and no municipal group can spend money of any kind to support ballot initiative once it hits the ballot. So while the school committee could be invited to speak and explain the need for something, it's the political action committee that would actually run a yes campaign for either this or for an operational override. Once it hits the ballot, campaign finance laws come into effect. And so, there are prohibitions against spending public funds on a campaign. That's the short answer.
Okay. And the only reason I ask is, my parents live in Melrose, and last November they passed a debt exclusion override to fix 3 fire stations and a police station for $130 million. And my parents had no idea. So, they only found out after their taxes increased. So, I was just curious, being, an Indian immigrant, they know a lot more about what's happening back home in India, but not necessarily in their own town. So I just wanted to make sure that there was a way of making sure that we're reaching all families so they know what they're, and it is a positive, absolutely, supporting our schools, but I just want to make sure that it's communicated well and that everybody's aware beforehand. Thank you.
Yes, I think those are great points. Any other questions about this?
Yeah.
The timeline itself?
Just point of clarification. So clearly it seems like there's a couple of different things going on here. There are the number 2 on the timeline, when the select board would vote to put this on the November ballot. Like that is sort of that's a point at which it's either moving forward or it's not moving forward for this particular timeline rather. When we get to what it says B and C, so the recommendations, if it's on the November ballot, then the select board and the warrant committee both weigh in with their recommendation. At that time, those recommendations would not be binding, right? Those would be recommendations like we're used to seeing, and town meeting members take those into account when they are deciding for themselves whether or not to support something. But it would be the town meeting vote that, again, similar to next week's select board meeting, is sort of either it moves forward or it's not moving forward, right? So just to distinguish between those.
Yes, that's correct. A vote to put it on the ballot is not necessarily a vote to support the initiative. Similar to their warrants that go up in front of town meeting, and the select board might vote to not support a warrant that is in front of town meeting and ask that town meeting vote it down.
Right. And so so for the select board to vote to put it on the ballot, to vote for the residents to be able to vote on it, is not necessarily meaning that members of the select board individually support the question itself. And they would have a later opportunity to not recommend a yes vote or to recommend a no vote. So I'm just not sure. I like this slide because I'm not sure that sequence of events had been laid out that clearly before. Amanda, go ahead.
I guess following up on your point, Lizzie. So I guess that's where it gets curious to me, that I just to understand it, I don't know who could weigh in on this, but if it's not being recommended as a ballot question, it's weird. I almost don't see two, and like then if they're not saying they're going to put it on the ballot, and then is that not the same as not recommending it? I mean, Mark or Glenn, would you know the?
Yeah, no, I think I understand. Yeah, I think I understand your question. I mean, I think, yeah, if the select board is refusing to put it on, if they vote no to put it on the ballot, then again, I guess they could do that for a couple of reasons, but I think one could certainly be that they don't support the project itself. And it could be, I don't want to speak for the select board in terms of the reasoning behind their vote, but there could be potentially other reasons that they they say they support the project, but don't want it in the fall. But I think a fair statement would be that they don't support the project at this time, at least, would be a fair way of characterizing that. But I think the reverse is not quite true. Like if they vote to put it on the ballot, that doesn't necessarily mean they are voting to support the project.
Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question regarding how the funding of this project is going to be like. Is it Mark, since you have an estimate from the construction company, is it possible to make a timeline similar to what you are showing us right here on how does that exclusion is going to affect our property tax in the next 5-10 years or so? So the residents of the town will be easier to understand how is approving this project going to affect our family financial situations.
Yeah. Yeah, no, great question. This is where it gets a little bit away from the school building committee's role and more into the town administrator's role, right? The town administrator is putting together a calculator of that would show residents, right, similar to what people have flagged that other communities have done, right? That's a pretty standard process of like, hey, here's the overall bill, here's the amount of tax implication each year for the average household, which in Milton I think is just over $1 million, and then here's the amount I think. Select member Roxanne Musto had asked for that amount at each $100,000 increment of housing value. And so I think the plan is to do that and to just make clear for folks what it is. The exact timeline for implementation is not 100% like certain because it depends on when the construction starts and when we spend down the money. Because unlike a ballot, an operational override where that hits, July 1st, the new fiscal year, a debt exclusion override means we can pull the money out, but we don't need to pull a full in this case, $173 million as of, November 5th, right, the day after the election. We would then pull maybe a little bit to cover the additional design costs and then, construction costs, and you start paying it down and pulling more money. So it wouldn't be until the project is fully completed that you pull down, what you'd assume is the full amount. And then at that point, the full impact of the tax, will start hitting you. Also, the timeline is, again, it depends a little bit on what the town administrator chooses to do. Typically, these are 30-year. This is split up cost over 30 years. There is I think, as others have mentioned, there's like a bill in front of the legislature to change that to allow towns to borrow over 40 years, which obviously decreases the impact on any individual year. There's also borrowing ideas of, hey, you make it cheaper, like you borrow at a lower interest rate at the start and higher at the back, right? So you keep up with inflation. So actually your stuff increases over time, or you do the opposite where the amount decreases over time as you pay down the debt. I think most towns just do a flat rate because it's kind of easier for folks to understand, hey, this is the amount I'm going to be paying every year. But again, those are things that the school building committee, the school committee don't control. The town administrator would, and I'd assume if this was voted on by the select board, would pretty quickly come out and say, here is what the town's plan would be for this, right? Here's the interest rate we're thinking of, here's the total debt obligation each year. I hope I explained that well, but Glenn's jumping in, I'm sure will correct me.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Go ahead.
Yeah, what we did in past overrides, the first thing we do is get a sort of a schedule of borrowing from the contractor to see how much money you're going to need when. Mark alluded to this. And you do some of it in short-term anticipation notes, but at certain points, you'll be borrowing certain amounts throughout the whole project. They usually talk to their bond consultants about what they should propose as an interest rate. And what we've done in the past is given a graph actually in the warrant when we brought it to town meeting of here's the anticipated debt service to the town on each of the next, in that time it was 20 years when we did the current project. So you could see it go up and then start to decrease. In the past, there are different ways, as Mark put it, to borrow money. What we've done in the past is to pay, in the case of the last building project, 1/20th of the principal each year plus whatever interest accrued. When you do that, you pay more at the point at which you borrowed all the money, and the payments go down over time because you're obviously paying less interest the further into it you go. It's not usually done like a mortgage, where you take out an amount and you pay a fixed amount over the period of the mortgage. The town doesn't usually do that, or at least in Milton's case has not in the past. But certainly the goal would be, in whatever warrant appeared for town meeting, you would have some sort of graph to show the impact of the debt service over time. And from that, you could then work out, for instance, if it's X dollars in a certain year, what's the cost, per 100,000 to a household, the sort of question that was asked. So that's sort of a secondary computation you could do often when you see it costing, $7 million this year. What does that mean to the average household? And so that's sort of a secondary computation you can do. But I mean, you don't have to do it that way, but that's the way Milton has done it for the past debt exclusions, just for information.
Thank you so much for the information. Then I'm wondering, like, the timeline is very short. And in order to have all those informations available for people to make decisions on whether or not for the select boards to put the questions on the ballots, or for the resident of the town to vote for in the November meeting, is the timeline is just a couple months away. So what is, like,
So time is short. In terms of the debt obligation stuff, though, I believe the town administrator has already been working on that. I don't think that's going to be a heavy lift to get that information out in front of folks. I think it's just a matter of it doesn't make sense to put it out in front of folks and worry them if the select board isn't going to put this on the ballot. So that is information that, and again, that's Nick's department, the town administrator's department, and so I defer to him on that. But I think some of the work has already started, and that information can come out pretty quick. I think the piece really is going to be the education, to the point Amanda made, and refining this value management piece of, is the 173 the right number? Can we get that down? What would be a more acceptable number for the town? If 173 is too high, what is the number? And then can we hit that number while still providing the programming that we know we need to provide for our kids? So I think those are continued conversations that the select board, the school building committee will need to have, and potentially that we will need to have if there's some conversation of, altering the programming for the building, that I think would need to come back in front of the school committee to vote on and agree to say, yes, we agree with that direction.
got it. Thank you so much.
Does anybody else have any questions or conversation? Yes, Amanda, go ahead.
I don't know if we're getting into, if there was more you were going through, or if we're talking any more about the feasibility or cost.
Yes.
Are you going through that? Okay, I can save my question.
No. I think ask the questions. I mean, I don't have any presentation on those things.
Okay. So when we're looking, kind of, if you're looking as much as you can, apples and apples, at other construction projects that have happened, the comparable projects that we've looked at, it looks like there are two numbers that we're parsing out. So one, it looks like the construction cost, and then there's the soft costs. And so when we are looking at other comparable projects, are we comparing construction to construction? Do you know what I mean? Because we'll go out and it's like, I think if I looked at it right, it was like 133-ish, 133.5 for the construction. So, and that's where you're getting your price per square foot. And, we can say, is that comparable to the other projects that have been done? The other projects that have been done, are we using their construction cost? Does that make sense? So there's 133.5, but then there's that 30% that gets us to the 173. So when we're looking at it, is it 133 versus, you know, if another project was 122 and that's just construction? Do you know what I mean? Am I making sense?
Yeah, you're making sense. I think it just depends on what the comparison group is. So I think when we were sharing, like when when Sean was presenting to select board and we're presenting costs, what we were sharing, what he was sharing in terms of like the Chapman Middle School, and I'm just putting it now being $128 million at $508 a square foot, right? That is, that was built back in 2020. I believe that was total cost for the project, 4 years ago. So including that 30% margin, which is again pretty typical in every project that you just put that on top of the whatever the construction amount is.
Okay. I know this is a weird question, but could we confirm that? Only because I think that then I just want to make sure that, like, as we're looking at, as people are considering, you know, getting into the weeds on it, like.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll say two things on like just how the cost estimate works. Like most of the cost estimate that Peter Bradley, the PMNC do, right? They are a specialty within school building. And so as you see from the feasibility study, the feasibility estimate, you see kind of each of the breakdown items. I can pull that up too. Give me a sec. Share the screen. Can you all see this? Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, he essentially does most things on $1 per square foot amount, which is pretty typical, especially at this point in time. And so you can see kind of what the construction dollar per square amount is for the two new buildings. And obviously the site work is just the site work, and kind of the subtotal. The things that increase the cost obviously above kind of estimated construction, because at this point we don't have all the finishes refined, right? We haven't spent all the money we'd need to have full construction drawings. I would say kind of every element of the building. We have this 15% design contingency on top of this 95 million to essentially say that, like, hey, there are a lot of unknowns still here, and so his estimate is not going to be 100% accurate. And so given how early we are, it's 15% is kind of a standard within the estimating community contingency that they put at this phase. And then as we continue to update designs, you imagine that this amount, this 15%, would reduce to, after design drawings, to 10%, and then construction drawings, you keep like 2.5%. Once you kind of get to the end. So you reduce that number. Some of that money could go away. Some of that money will just move from design pricing contingency up to the 95 million. I mean, ultimately what he's looking at too is this $877.46 per square foot. He is pulling that from all the data on school construction projects that are happening, right? The school is not, we're not doing anything that's particularly unique here. And so this is where the average cost of a school building project is falling currently based on the data he has. It's not the lowest cost, so certainly some projects might come in below this, and Milton's project might come in below this, right? We have some favorable pieces regarding, like, hey, it's flat land, it's kind of easy access. But also some projects come in higher than this, and Milton's could come in higher than this, right? All of this is an estimate. But what this provides us is good information around just to hold to as it relates to kind of design efforts moving forward, to say, hey, like, what is the number that the town is going to allow us to spend? And then, then you have a budget that you can move forward with. Again, whether budget ends up being the 133 or we somehow cut back and reduce this slightly. As you'll know, without a budget, without some constrictions, good ideas can keep popping up, you can keep moving forward. And so what a good project needs at some point is to tie the budget down so that we can move forward and say, all right, we're going to design something to this number because that's all the money we have, and allow the project to move forward, because otherwise you're kind of just hoping and guessing. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, so it actually did, because I guess the question is, if we're looking at comparable projects and price per square foot, this is what we're comparing it to, the 133,529, as opposed to then when you add in the furnishings. That's what I meant, like that next, the bit that gets us the next, 40 million, if you will, that would get us to the 173. That doesn't factor into the price per square foot because it's not construction. So it's just, I guess it's more in the realm of, as people are thinking about it, or as I'm thinking about it, are we way out of whack when we're looking at the cost per square foot, or are we in the realm of others? And that 133 is the number that we're comparing it to, as opposed to adding in the furnishings, et cetera. Does that make sense?
It does, and I'd just say that, like, again, I'd love this 877.46 number to be less.
Yeah.
But there's nothing about the design that is driving this number. This number is, again, what the cost estimator is seeing across kind of other projects and plopping this within our, essentially the only thing that's at this point really driving costs within this estimate is the square footage amounts, right? This 152,177.
Yeah, yeah, and that's
so-
just
and
what
this-
I want.
Yeah.
This is the apples and apples part. The next piece, we're not looking at, we're getting an estimate for 173, and the other projects that are comparable are 125, you know what I mean? No, it's 133 we're looking at the same chunk, because that helps. It's just the top portion is what the comp is to. You answered my question. Thank you.
All right, Anna.
So, Mark, you mentioned a few times that, figuring out how to bring costs down. And then you also mentioned maybe what is that number, that like sweet spot that would, is acceptable to the town. Like, I wanted to know, just like from being on the school building committee, like what your thoughts are on, having conversations with the architects in terms of where we could bring costs down.
Yeah, we still need to have conversations on that, but again, we don't have gold-plated toilets like designed into this, so that really the way to bring costs down is to cut square footage, right? And to cut square footage means to cut programming. And so whether that's, again, we're actually going to get rid of the auditorium because it's not worth the cost, or we're going to, again, maybe we try and shrink class sizes a little bit and get them down to 10. Those types of things honestly aren't going to move. Like doing some small square footage adjustments aren't going to move the needle significantly from my experience. But we did talk about that at the school building committee yesterday, and I raised with the architects and PMA also, who's our OPM, who has a lot of experience working on these types of projects, of like that needs to be an upcoming conversation of just like what are the places where we think we could cut without affecting the programming, or where we could cut and affect programming, but we'll be okay, with that. I think those are things. It's just, again, it gets back a little bit to the timeline of the first step really is trying to, like, are we going to have this on the ballot? And some of those conversations yesterday didn't, from our rep from the select board, it didn't seem like the number itself was actually a concern as related to putting on the ballot. It was more other factors outside of the school building cost that would potentially hold up the select board from doing that. But I'm sorry, Selena.
Yes, the other thing I would add is that, as part of the design process or the visioning process, there was some of that, there was already the exercise to first, let's think about everything that would be great to have. And that was obviously where you want to start, but then doing a reality check from there, right? And do a couple of paring down exercises to get to a more reasonable project size. So the square footage has already been reduced. And, looking at the construction estimate, you don't see anything there that is, glamorous. It really is what it takes. And I think it's also important as we look at comparing total project costs or construction costs, always making sure it's apples to apples, right? That we're looking at, we have to take into account cost escalation. So if these were projects that were completed a few years ago, if you were to do the same project now, the cost would be a lot more. If I'm correct, Mark, and please correct me, but you estimated very quickly that is it about $7 million more per year if we continue to drag this on, just based on the sort of escalation projections that we were able to show last week. Is it 5.5? Is that what it is, the escalation? But so if you take that into account, and when we're comparing other projects, I think we need to factor in the timing too, right? That those same projects would cost more today.
Yeah, the escalation that again, the cost estimator is using based on what they are seeing is 5.33. So this is just escalation from where, again, because he's doing pricing based on where costs are now, but they're going to change, in 12 months. So we carried 5.33, which means that, again, by building next year instead of this year, it's an extra $5 million. If you do 5.33% on top of the 133, then that's about $7 million extra. And so not all these things fall into that, but again, it's somewhere between like $5 and $6 million extra dollars when we wait, and obviously that compounds over years. So again, the delaying is not going to make the cost smaller. I think it's just a really important thing. Like if we need a school, the best time to build it is yesterday, and the second best time to build it is today. And so like that's the cheapest you're ever going to get it. The only other way to control costs is, again, this square footage piece, which I think that we can have more conversations on. But that's really it, is time and size are like the two things that are going to change the number. Delaying is not gonna, as much as I would love it, because I want this number to come down, that's not gonna happen.
Okay, so then I do have a follow-up question. So if we're looking at 5 million at 5.33% increase annually, I know the price that we've been kind of seeing for the last couple of years has been between 80 and $90 million. I mean, obviously it's doubled in this estimate, or close to doubled. How did that, I guess I'm trying to understand, when that cost came in, like how it wasn't, we had an idea of what it was going to cost, and now it's obviously gone up significantly. So like what was the percentage increase from, let's say, last year to this year? I mean, if it's, like, or did we estimate much lower than we thought it was going to cost?
Yeah, I think, again, 5 years ago, escalation, obviously, if you do even just 5.33% over 5 years for a $90 million construction cost. Again, I think some of this too is, I don't know exactly all the thinking behind the stated different numbers, but if we're talking construction costs and not total costs, that's something that people have brought up, which is valid. But a $90 million construction cost with 5.33% escalation over 5 years gets us to, $116 million. So it is off. It's not significantly off, and the escalation during COVID was significantly higher than 5.33%. And so, I think the delay of with how long it has taken to find land in the town, which is so difficult, how long it has taken to get that through, and just, again, five years has definitely raised the price. You see other projects that are similar sizing in that Chapman Middle School that was built back in 2020, I believe. And again, I think that price was 120 million. And I think it was a little bit bigger than ours. But like those, I think it's just wrong. So whatever number was previously stated, right, it was, I think, attempting to be an educated guess. And at this point, it is wrong. And that's kind of why we do this. And we get the estimate here to now talk through it, but it's fair. Sorry.
So in addition to that, the the program, what we were planning before was smaller than this one, in the sense that, for instance, we were not taking into account an auditorium. So that's something we weren't planning for in this new school. But obviously, looking at the current peers, it would not make sense for us to then move the older kids into a new building and say, sorry, there's no auditorium for you. So taking that into account, so we were planning for an 115,000 square foot project, and so the footage, square footage increased. So that's to think about it, that once we got deeper into programming and the programming that we need, obviously space became something that grew. And so that's the size of the project grew slightly.
Thank you.
Sure.
Sorry, this was one that was presented by, again, this was part of the select board presentation. And so this just lays out kind of what our initial cost, the initial DRA study, right, was estimating, to Selena's point. This was the square footage. It was a very rough estimate. This is like the MSBA stuff, which again doesn't include anything for pre-K. So this just kind of lays out how the square footage has changed over time, which obviously, as I mentioned before, right, square footage drives your cost pretty significantly.
Go ahead, Anna.
Sorry, I just had a follow-up question since you brought up that slide. I know in there you have lunches and it says 3 lunches, and now currently Pierce has 4 lunches. And I know a concern that, I remember, I think it was my first year, there were 2 middle school, I think they were middle school students who came in and spoke and said they would like lunch to be increased. How big are what are you thinking in terms of like the cafeteria's capacity to increase, maybe do 2 lunches versus 3 so that students have more time? Because I know that's been a tough, by the time they get their lunch and come back and sit, it's lunch is over.
Yeah, again, I think it's a trade-off piece of you make it bigger and therefore it costs more. And so I think one thing we did was, I mean, from my experience working in schools, 3 lunches is a very reasonable amount of time, right? You have 30-minute lunches, that's an hour and a half in your day. And so you can do that from 11:30 to 1. And so I think, when you get to the 4 lunch piece, as you say, or you're at Cunningham Calicut, which has 3,200 lunches, apparently, like those things are much more challenging, but 3 lunches is not out of the kind of normal realm. I think the other piece with a cafeteria is outside of lunches, it's typically a fairly underutilized space in schools. You can hold events in there occasionally, and things like the Cunningham Calicut one uses it very well. But in a lot of schools, it is kind of wasted space at times outside. And so trying to think through how we can design the cafeteria better to be of more use throughout the day to support student learning, and also just cut it down to save cost in order to kind of, again, move from this 170 to the 152 as we were going through that.
Thank you.
Also, just reshare this too. This was shared in the select board. Again, another thing we were paying attention to as we were cutting down square footage was this, the total amount, comparing that to, what is the average square footage for most other schools per student. So based upon our student enrollment was really high at first with the 200. Getting it down to kind of our area, we're at the 191. I'll also say, if you compare this to other schools that are of the similar size, right, the 700, 675, those are still above ours. Only two that are below ours are schools that are, a good bit larger, but about 300 more kids. And so, your shared space, right, your auditorium, your cafeteria split up over more kids usually reduces your square footage per student cost. But even if you take all of those, the average, we're still kind of right in line with that. So that was another piece we were looking at, again, with an effort to try and control costs and get the project what we hoped was going to be a lower number than this, but certainly to as low a number as we could.
Sure, Amanda?
I guess as a follow-up to that, when we're looking at our average square footage, oh, I guess you have it here. I was just wondering how, knowing that the pre-K, you need more space per kid, basically, for lack of putting it another way. Does that impact the average number, or, but you pulled them out, right? So 25, so it's still within the.
Yeah, I mean, the cafeteria, the auditorium are spaces that are going towards the middle school and not towards
Gotcha.
the school building. And so that's, I think, but yes, you're right. Usually a classroom size itself is larger on a per student basis, a preschool building, but it's those additional shared spaces within the primary building that kind of push it up. But even with that, yes, as you can see, the square footage is slightly higher for the preschool.
I guess a follow-up question to that is, and I thought I saw a slide somewhere at one point in my lifetime on this, but as we're looking at capacity, right? So we know we're right now enrollment is a full grade level above, right? We have, what is it, like 380, about ballpark, that's the number that it's been running at, 390. So are we looking, and again, I know we're keeping in mind the square footage and trying to contain it. Are we keeping in mind the potential, like we're building to the increased capacity, but are we building to more than that? In the sense of like, if there were growth, and I just, I worry about the number of new units that we have coming in with, with some of the 40Bs that have been approved. I mean, I know there's some ratio for 3 bedrooms equal a family, but, right now there are about 330 units of housing that have been approved for zoning. So is there any sort of elasticity for that to, assume that a portion of that would be families as well? You know what I mean? Like, so I know we're building for capacity and we're building for what we currently can project, but I know the new projects aren't included in those projections, but is there room to accommodate that if it were more? I guess that's the question.
So the plan number is higher than the existing. So there is some of that is built into the project. And even our thinking in terms of the preschool is being proposed in a way that would allow for expansion down the line if we needed it. But the current buildings would have higher capacity than what we need at this particular point. Not by a lot, but enough that we have wiggle room there.
Okay, thanks.
And that really seems to be the tension that's going to need to get navigated in the coming weeks is, how to reduce costs, like how to be serious about actually looking at like possible adjustments programmatically to reduce the square footage while not putting ourselves in a position that we were coming out of the project 20 years ago, where we were, as you're really like warning about, Amanda, we built for what we had at that time and not for what we, would end up having in the future. And that's why we're partly in this situation of overcrowding now. So I think that to me is the needle that needs to get threaded here, like between the school building committee working with the school department to sort of do that, those adjustments to reduce the cost, which I think we just have to really apply ourselves to doing. I mean, that's what we've been talking about here. So Anna, go ahead.
So I do have a follow-up question based on that. So we're moving 5th grade out of elementary to create room at the elementary schools and putting 5th and 6th together at the current Pierce, and then moving 7th and 8th out of Pierce into this new upper middle school. Have we thought about costs associated with kind of reconfiguring the other 5 schools to you know, and what that would take, like what's the cost associated with kind of reconfiguring those schools to make that new layout now work with this new middle school at play. And then my other question is, with our sixth grade now is the largest sixth grade coming into Pierce. At that point, by the time, if the school is built by September of 2027, that school, that sixth grade class would be coming into, I think, ninth grade by then. And can the high school hold, have the capacity to take in such a large class?
Yeah, great questions. To answer the first one around like, do we have cost estimates for how we would need to reset the spaces at the other schools? The answer is no. That said, like most spaces are again currently classrooms and then therefore can be opened back up for classrooms, right? For the missing art rooms, for missing music rooms. So you take those back, move those current clone rooms just into the fifth grade classrooms. And so there's not a lot of costs associated with that reorganization. There could be some spaces where in order to create more pull-out spaces for folks, right, that we would want to put up an extra wall or add an extra staff bathroom, right, to address those needs in the future. I think that those are all things that are, when we talk about like comparable costs, right, we're talking about $133 million construction project. Those things are not going to be even kind of a drop in the bucket. Because again, most of the spaces can be utilized, even if they're not specifically designed for their need, they're a space, and that's way better than what folks have, even if they have a slightly oversized office or oversized pull-out space for kids. Some of the space that might need more of that would be, and again, I think this is, if we move forward with the project, some of the high school space support would be moving things out of the high school that we can, and potentially moving them into other buildings, maybe Pierce, maybe the elementary schools, but like the central office spaces, right, which the principal of the high school has brought up before, like used to be counseling spaces, and we'd love to have those back as, you know, from our tours. Again, consolidated facilities that are right now in the basement, we have nowhere else to put them, right, but could those go to Pierce now that there's more school? And the other piece is the campus strategy of having the upper middle school space near the high school. Is there have been discussions within the SBC and within the visioning sessions of like, how do we create spaces that could also be used by the high school? You know, how we create these STEM spaces that potentially the high school could leverage, or obviously we're building an extra auditorium, an extra gym. So like how are we able to kind of consolidate the two, given they'll be so close to each other to support each other within that work?
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other question or discussion? When we move to our votes, you know, just to remind ourselves that what we are doing is taking votes this morning on whether we recommend this project to move forward. This is a non-binding vote. It's a recommendation to the select board that we'll be voting on. But it's good to have all of our discussion here now. So Anna, go back to you.
I'm so sorry. I know we haven't really talked about like the design layout yet. Is that something we can quickly talk through before we go into voting? Thank you.
I'm happy to answer any questions. Again, obviously, if you remember, Sean came last week when he did his presentation, we talked about the designs, but definitely if there are other questions you have.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I was looking at, I mean, and we talked a lot about bringing costs down. Is there a way, if we're creating, I think when I was doing, so for instance, doing the math, Pierce is at 160,000 square feet right now for 860 students. The middle school, the upper middle school is 127,262 square feet, I believe. I was wondering, since pre-K is now at 24,915 square feet, is there a way to reduce costs by putting pre-K at the Pierce. And maybe using that space. I know one of the, I've had conversations in the past, like where, it would be great to have some, athletics programs at the middle school, and they just don't have the space or capacity for it. I know there's a track program that a lot of students sign up for, and they have to practice elsewhere. So just wondering, like, if we are building this upper middle school, would it make sense to maybe move pre-K over to the Pierce, since we're, I think we have like almost 33,000 square feet there. And then using that space that's currently designated for pre-K and turning that into a field for the middle school to use, so that they're not sharing spaces for after school sports with the high school, because I know it's been very challenging with fields being full and at capacity, and a lot of times we can't offer programs, and a lot of students I know have to join like club sports in order to participate and stuff. So just thinking at that level, if that's been considered as a way to bring costs down. So
Sorry, I'm just pulling up I want to pull up a picture of the site so that folks can see what you're talking about. Yes, so I think this is getting into, like what our next steps are in terms of how we bring down numbers. And as I shared, like the only way to do that is to cut square footage. And so obviously one thing that could be discussed, and I think will be discussed, is the preschool program, right? Is that something that you pull out? Because as you said, that is 27,000 square feet, that essentially, if you do the per cost, right, the $877 a square foot, quick math, that's about $24 million that it would cut from the construction cost, and then that's not counting the you then do the 30% on top of that, and so that is, anyways, that is a lot of that is some cost savings that certainly gets us down below. I think that is a conversation that the school building committee needs to have, and that's kind of what I generally reference, of having Arrow Street and PMA come back of like, what are these proposals? What would we talk about in order to bring down costs? The ultimate decision as to whether or not to drop the preschool, I believe, and somebody can correct me, would need to come back to the school committee to have the school committee vote to approve it, because the school committee is the one that voted to approve the initial project plan, which was another elementary school, and then the school committee voted to change that to the upper middle school. So if we are changing programming elements, we would need to. But certainly, if you got rid of it, not only you have the cost, but this area in the back. I'm not sure if any of this parking space would be needed, or some, but you certainly open up space in the back.
okay, that's really good to know that there is some, wiggle room there to just kind of, play around with the layout. The other question I had was, I was looking at the capacity of the auditorium, and it's currently 350 seats. And the Pierce Auditorium is at 530. So that's quite a big difference. I know we're trying to reduce square footage, and as a result, we have to make spaces smaller, so that we're not sacrificing programming. But as you know, Pierce Players is a huge part of Pierce. And I was wondering how we're going to, like, especially, I know when my daughter was in 6th grade, she was in the ensemble, but like, I know as you go into 7th and 8th grade, it's a, the program gets more, it gets really, kids have a lot of speaking parts and larger parts. So how are we going to kind of continue Pierce Players, or whatever that ends up being, at the 7th and 8th grade level? Are we going to be looking at hiring additional staff to make that happen? I know in the past that we have shared staff between buildings, like math interventionists, and it hasn't quite worked out well for us. So in that case, what are we thinking? Would we combine the two programs together for Pierce Players, or would we keep them separate and have two separate programs, that one where 5th and 6th grades participate, and one that 7th and 8th graders participate?
You want to take that, Selena?
I was going to speak to the pre-K comment, if that's okay, and then I don't feel like I'm equipped to answer the programming question around here's, I mean, we got to consider it, but I just don't, I'm not prepared to do that. But in terms of going back to the pre-K, I think one of the things that we need to think about, and I know that there will be sort of that desire to continue to manage costs, which we have to do, but we also have to continue to keep in mind our needs into the future. I think that's critical for us to think about. When it comes to pre-K, I think there's, you know, sort of where the country's moving, and we need to be ready, is to universal pre-K. And while the space right now that we're proposing would not allow us to offer, you know, universal pre-K, it would at least give us the foundation to begin to work towards that. So I think as it's something that I would caution us to think about, you know, to make sure that we're not just thinking of the short term, but we're also thinking of into the future and our needs. That becomes critical. It is a point of discussion, and it's something that needs to be had, but also to remind ourselves that town meeting, you know, supported the project of this two new, you know, our ability to do an upper middle school and a pre-K space. That's what town meeting supported. So that's something, another thing to consider. But in terms of the Pierce question, in terms of the programming, I can't answer that right now.
Yeah, all I'll say the programming stuff is I know throughout this, obviously within the visioning session and things like that, Peter and his team have been involved, right? Bill Fish has been involved. A lot of people have been involved in terms of what has informed the design of the program. I think there still needs to be, we need to see what happens with, like, if this moves forward, what does it actually move forward, because there are implications for individual staff members and their roles that, you know, we don't want to project right now and say, you know, what the impacts would be without kind of having a finalized plan. I think the other part is as it relates to the staffing is, like, at a certain point, that's also going to be limited by, you know, what funding is approved through any operational override in the future. So while we even might want to staff in a certain way, you know, we already have that today where we wanted a few more roles, a few more things that we are unable to get and we're not able to get from a funding standpoint. And so I think there's just going to be a natural kind of, this is the dollar, this is how we're going to have to figure it out. But this is where I think Peter would be great to jump in if he were here. And so I think maybe we could have him follow up with you or with the committee as a whole, just to talk through kind of where they're at, maybe with a little bit more with programming ideas around staffing.
And, you know, I just wanted to kind of, as a follow-up, just comment, I think that's where, like, I'm struggling with a little bit. I understand, you know, Selena, what you mentioned about pre-K, and that's something that we should definitely plan for. My challenge is, and I'm going to use Melrose as another example, is they had a debt exclusion override in November and followed by an operational override in June. And the operational override was for $7.7 million, and it failed. So I think what I'm really struggling with, and I know we ran into this recently when we had to go back to select board to ask for more funds, is we have to think about that. And I'm just really, really, like, concerned that, you know, I mean, I'm hearing, like, you know, we'll have to think about this and we'll have to think about that down the road. But the challenge is, if we don't really have a plan, I'm afraid that we'll be in a situation where we would have to cut teaching staff. And I'm worried about that. And that scares me very, very much. I know we went through this whole budget process this spring. We've requested an override. It did not pass. I mean, it did not, you know, select board didn't approve it for whatever reason. And there were positions that we couldn't hire for. So this worries me. I think with this number, Because we'll have to go in for an operational override. It doesn't seem like, based on what happened at last week's select board and all these findings that we've had since then, we don't have ARPA, we don't have free cash. We've kind of depleted our rainy day funds as well. So I think we're in a position where we need that operational override to pass no matter what. So I do worry. I wish, in hindsight, we had done the operational override in the spring, because it'd be a no-brainer to put this on the ballot in the fall. So, and it would have been a natural progression. So, and I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, because I'd love to hear, because that's what I'm really struggling with.
Yeah, just to jump in there, I think there's a natural chicken or an egg situation here, and that like having the operational override might be helpful to inform this, but like, what does the operational override ask if we don't know if we have the school building, right? And so, and I want to clarify that my answer is shouldn't be taken as to like that they've spent no time thinking about this. Again, I just don't want to speak for Peter and for his team. I know they've thought about this and have been working towards kind of staffing, but there are questions of, to the idea you raise. If we cut out the pre-K wing, well, now that changes, like, then we don't need some of those things that maybe we needed. And so like ultimately having some direction, because the positions aren't going to be needed tomorrow, like, again, on November 6th, they're going to be needed when the project is completed. And so there is some time, and, in my opinion, having certainty of knowing, hey, this is what we're moving forward with, this is the program that the town wants, then we can come back to say, like, okay, here is our ideal staffing, here's our less ideal staffing, or maybe we split people cross role like buildings. But it's certainly, you kind of need to know both of those pieces to fully inform the conversation. I'm sorry, Amanda, I jumped in before you.
No, that's okay. I guess, I think one of the concerns I have in not doing something, I just really, going through, I have a big concern around a lot of the, services and shared space being used for reading instruction, OT, PT, speech, the fact that a lot of these are being done either in places that aren't necessarily private. We have, I'm not even talking about the issue of the stairwell, which is, really concerning to me, but, going through schools and seeing, partitions next to lockers where kids are getting speech therapy, or pullouts in the, if it's a pullout in the library and it's already a shared space in a library with 2 classrooms and partitions where it's already distracting. I just think that there's a big portion of our population in school that is being impacted, where they're not getting services in the way that they should be getting them. And that we are having shared, kids have certain services if they're on an IEP in their grid, and if they're not, if we're having teachers who have to sign out a particular room at a particular time, I worry about our district's ability to deliver on those services that are there, because we don't have the capacity, we don't have the room. So I think that makes us really vulnerable. And I get concerned that we don't have space to create programming that would allow us to bring, what do we have, 72 kids out of district that, that's, that budget, we're looking at that right now. It's a $5 million tuition budget for those things. And so, this enables us to begin to think about places, programs, and to bring those kids back. But if we don't have the space, we can have all the programs that we want, but we can't bring some of those back, which are long-term, financial impact on the school, but also, on the community. So that's one area that, as I was walking around the schools, it was really concerning to me that where those services are taking place, and the inability of us as a district to service those appropriately.
Go ahead, Amanda.
Um,
Anna, sorry.
That's okay. Amanda, I actually have a follow-up question for you. You raised a really good point in terms of space. I know we have a lot of kids out of district. And if we were to create programming in our buildings once space frees up, how does that work? Because I mean, students who are placed out of district are getting a certain level of service, right, for that cost. And when we bring them back into the district, don't we have to invest to create those programs? Or is that something like, because I mean, there's a cost associated with going to the district, out of district and to a specific school, let's say like the Carroll School, or, they have a specific program for dyslexia. Like, are we able to, or in a position with our current staff, be able to create a similar program of the same caliber? And is it just a space issue, in your opinion?
I'm going to start speaking out of my area of expertise. I think it's both, but I think they're all long-term gains. Do you know what I mean? Like if you have $5 million worth of obviously all kids don't have the same abilities or disabilities. But even if you look at the cost of a teacher or a reading specialist compared to an out-of-district tuition, there's a huge difference. It's investment spending as opposed to that $5 million. That tuition occurs every single year. So if a kid's spending we're spending $80,000 on tuition and not including their transportation to go out of district, and that's one student per year. I think that's the way that we need to look at it. It's a longer term solution. And you look at, I think you look at the greatest gain, like where are the kids that we could support initially? Is it around dyslexia, around learning disabilities? So it's both. I mean, it doesn't always necessarily have to just be space, but I think there are certain programs that would require space, transition programs where you might need a kitchen and you might need space to be able to teach kids daily living skills where we just don't have the space or the programming for that. So I think it's both. I don't think you can parse them out, but I do think it's long-term. It's a longer term investment as opposed to spending $5 million a year continually. And that will just increase as we saw last year. Does it answer it?
Yeah, thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll say that is something that also has come up within the visioning session around trying to, again, be able to bring programs back into the district to help offset. And again, districts do that because it's a cost saver, right? Otherwise, every district would just outsource all of their special education services. And there are some services that we're not going to be able to provide on site. We're not going to create our own school of the deaf or something like that. But there are many that we could if we had space. And then after you have the space, certainly in a point Amanda made, like staffing, you need to find the right staff for it. But it doesn't matter if you have the staff if you don't know where to put it. That's the crunch right now from what the district has shared.
Amanda, and what you said, I appreciate for myself personally, like the regrounding of the conversation also in our students' experiences and what they need and deserve. Keeping in mind, like from our overcrowding, and that here we are 5 years later, even if this moves forward now and stays on track, we know it's still several years before a building is ready to accommodate students. So I think, it's a both and, like, it's complicated. It's not ideal. There are a lot of factors that do make this challenging, including things we've named. Like, Anna, it's really important to name the fact that we're also sort of in this space of needing an operational override. We don't know exactly how that will play out. That's a total partnership collaboration led by the town and the select board and the town administrator, affecting all departments. But there's the need to bring the costs down from this ceiling that has now been established. Like, it's not feeling like, oh, this is a, easy thing to do. And yet there are still the students that are suffering, like from the fact of how long overdue this is. So that's what makes it challenging. Yeah, Anna, go ahead.
Sorry. So I do have a question in terms of what Arrow Street provided. I know we looked at some extruded floor plans, and I was wondering, is there more detail in terms of what the space looks like? I mean, like, I'm just curious if they were able to provide renderings and so on and so forth, even if they're not, exactly accurate. I mean, I'd like to know, for instance, the difference of a classroom at the upper middle school versus what a classroom at Cunningham looks like, for instance. I mean, and just, in my line of work, when we present a cost estimate to a client, we show them the possibilities, right? So to actually sell that price tag. And I haven't seen anything yet, so I'm just hoping. I haven't gotten the latest presentation. So if there is something, it'd be great if I could take a look.
Yeah, you have the latest presentation. So the amount of funding we have for the Arrow Street's work and PMA's work brings us to a feasibility study, and this is about, again, what we provided is essentially what a feasibility study looks like. I push back on the idea that Arrow Street is not trying to sell us on a design, like unlike maybe in the public-private sector. They're trying to deliver to us what we are asking of them. And so their job is not to like try and upsell us in any way, or they obviously have an architectural eye, right? An artistic eye. And so there are things architects like to do. But that's also why a number is really helpful to like say, all right, we've got to design to this number. But that is the extent we've gone. Moving forward, the next step is design development. And there will be a little bit more, again, as it relates to renderings. They don't typically do renderings of individual classrooms because individual classrooms are not, themselves particularly special unless you're talking about like a STEM room or a science lab, right? Which you get people excited and you can have like prettier pictures. But all those things would be in kind of the next phase of the project: design development, construction development. And at this point, we don't have funding for it. Our funding that we got from town meeting will run out at some point in kind of September with Arrow Street and PMA, hoping that the November vote will provide the additional funding that will allow the project to keep moving forward. And if not, we're essentially sitting on our hands until whenever there is a vote to the project. We're not going to be getting updated designs kind of as we wait, because there's no funding.
Okay, so, and just to clarify, I wasn't trying to say that Arrow Street is trying to upsell us, but it's really helps to like kind of have a visual. I know, I think it was last spring, we had, clay model renderings of what the outside of the building looks like. It really kind of helps visualize like, okay, this is what it's gonna look like. This is where the price tag comes from, and it's really just to kind of justify the cost, and it would be helpful to have some visuals more than ground plans. I understand the cost is obviously an issue. If they're out of money, then they can't. So, but it would have been helpful.
Yeah, the feasibility is really just on you refine programming and you refine kind of square footage size, and then from there they take that and pretty it up. So look forward to getting those as well, but we don't have them now.
Okay, thank you.
Are people ready to vote on the motions? We have two motions here. These are, as I said before, non-binding recommendations that will be shared with the select board, who is in the position to make the decision. The first is going to be pertains to the placing of the project, moving the project forward and placing it on a ballot in November. The second motion we have, because we'll do them back to back, is sort of hinging on if the select board were to move forward with placing the project debt exclusion on the November ballot, then a next step would be for the select board to then also call for a town meeting to take place prior to the November election. And that was reflected in the timeline that we looked at today. So just to explain what those two motions are for. Does anybody have any questions before we'll take a roll call vote, obviously, since we're virtual. Okay. Yes, Anna, go ahead.
I do have a question, and I apologize for my questions, but I know, Lizzie, there was some talk about possibly putting both the debt exclusion override and the operational override together on the ballot for the fall. Is that kind of gone away now?
My understanding of that, I'm not sure that it's gone away. I think the select board, I have not seen them sort of move that conversation forward. So I think they may still choose to do that, but I haven't heard any sort of updates from them on that. And I think how I interpret that is, they may not be pushing for that at this time. So, absent that sort of the work that would be taking place right now to pin down the number for that, that would be a separate ballot question. We haven't, and Katie and Glenn, I don't want to speak for you. I don't believe that the conversations have been taking place with the town administrator that would be moving us towards that as a possibility. Is that correct?
Correct. We haven't had any conversations specific to the override in the fall, so.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
Sorry. Okay, so this would just be the motions for this particular vote, right? As is written in our document.
As is, yeah. So just trying to keep it sort of focused on the immediate question before this debt exclusion, and what the select board and the town administrator are choosing to do pertaining to the operational override would be sort of happening separately.
Okay.
And I don't actually know exactly what that is at this point in time.
Okay. So it's not like we would be able to meet. I think Mark mentioned that select board is meeting next Tuesday, and I'm curious, can some of these questions in terms of what the staffing needs might be immediately that we would need in the next year, and once the new school gets built, like, would we be able to get more answers on that before next week? I mean, at this time, I just feel like there are a lot of outstanding questions that I don't quite have the answers to yet. And so I'm just a little concerned that this vote is a little premature based on that. So I'm really, really, as you know, I really wanted to do that spring override this year just to kind of get us through the next couple of years, even if it's a year or two. So it really concerns me that we haven't really had any discussions on kind of prioritizing that with this debt exclusion override. So I am worried about, obviously we need to do an operational override soon, and I'm worried about it not passing. So especially since, my experience with my parents' hometown, of Melrose. So that really concerns me very, very much. So I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity to get some of these questions answered, if there's a way to expedite putting both overrides, because I'd hate to vote for one and then the other one just goes away till next spring and doesn't happen, because, at the end of the day, our teachers make up our schools, and they provide, a great experience for all our students. And I would hate to lose even one of them.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. You're raising important, you know, points around this. And I think that is what makes this like kind of difficult. I know that, you know, the school department had been asked initially to provide information pertaining to like projections for an override. That was, my understanding is that was going several weeks back. And so I'm just not sure on the town side where that conversation stands at this point in time. And, you know, our challenge, of course, is, you know, the need to sort of weigh in as this body one way or another in ahead of the select board's making its decision. So I hear you though. It's not ideal.
No, it's not, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, I appreciate the discussion, everybody, and raising a lot of thoughtful questions. And Mark and Selena, thank you very much for giving us all the updates, the information, for representing the school committee throughout the work that's been taking place. Mark.
I'm sorry. I agree with that. I think the last point you made, Lizzie, is that I think the difference here with the override, again, with I wish they had done the override in the spring as we had asked. But I think the difference is the select board has the school vote on the agenda for next week. And so I think what we are doing is responding to an agenda item of the select boards to try and provide our input. The select board does not have an agenda item related to the override. I think they were, I agree that we should similarly kind of position ourselves within that conversation as well to advocate. So that's just the difference I see within the situation.
Thanks. Makes sense. Okay. I'll go ahead and make the motion to recommend that the select board places the ballot question on debt exclusion to fund a new school on the November 2024 election ballot. This will be a roll call vote.
I second the motion.
Okay, thank you. So the motion's been made and seconded. Dr. Miranda.
Yes.
Member Loring,
Yes.
Member Chu,
Yes.
Member Varghese,
I'm gonna be a no.
Member Serio,
Yes.
and I am a yes as well. The next motion is a motion to recommend that if the select board places the ballot question on debt exclusion on the November 2024 ballot, there be a fall town meeting prior to November 2024. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thanks. Okay, Dr. Miranda,
Yes.
Member Lauren,
Yes.
Member Chu,
Yes.
Member Varghese,
Yes.
Member Serio,
Yes.
and yes. All right, thank you, everybody. That concludes the chair's report. The rest of our items should move pretty quickly, hopefully. I'll hand it to you, Mark, for approval of vendor warrants.
Talking a lot. There's no approval needed because these warrants have not been fully approved. They weren't. I wasn't able to sign them yesterday. So they will be signed on Wednesday and we'll approve them at our next meeting. And again, as soon as I have the full electronic version too, I'll forward it out to y'all because as we've typically done.
Okay, great, thanks. So that just leaves approval of minutes. And I'd like to make a motion to approve the Milton School Committee minutes of July 16th, 2024.
Second.
Does anyone have any comments or edits to the minutes? Okay. Dr. Miranda,
Yes.
Member Chu,
Yes.
Member Loring,
Yes.
Member Varghese,
Yes.
Member Serio,
Yes.
and I'm a yes as well. Our next meeting agenda items. As we know, we have our governance retreat is our next meeting. Following that, we have a scheduled meeting for August 21st, which is sort of already moving into the back to school. At our meeting tomorrow, we will be assessing our FY24 goals and beginning to develop our FY25 goals for the school committee. And begin to actually look at our calendar sort of for the coming year, which will be an opportunity to also map out agenda items going forward under sort of in the context of our goal setting. So we'll see everybody there. And thank you very much again, everybody, especially Mark and Selena. And I hope you all have a great day. I'll make a motion to adjourn the meeting, 9:44 a.m. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Dr. Miranda?
Yes.
Member Varghese?
Yes.
Member Serio?
Yes.
Member Chu?
Yes.
Member Loring?
Yes.
Yes, I vote yes as well. So have a great day, everybody. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye.
See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.